All right, let's jump straight into this explainer and absolutely deconstruct everything you thought you knew about American domestic life. We're going to use historical and sociological data to separate fact from, well, a whole lot of fiction. We hear the phrase all the time, right? The quote-unquote traditional American family. It usually conjures up this very specific image of a standard nuclear family. You know, the breadwinner husband, a homemaker wife, and their kids. But ask yourself, is that actual historical reality? Or is it just a monolithic myth shaped by recent assumptions? Because the data tells us the American family has literally never been just one thing.
To get the real picture, our agenda today covers 5 different lenses. 1. Families across time. 2. The social class divide. 3. Racial and ethnic diversity. 4. The multiracial future. And 5. A constant state of change.
Starting off with Section 1, Families Across Time. It turns out the very definition of traditional completely depends on what century you're looking at. Back in 1607, during the colonial era, the family was strictly a multifunctional economic unit. It was basically a survival center for producing goods, and romantic love was actually considered a duty that came after you got married. But skip ahead to the 20th century, specifically the 1920s, and we see the birth of the companionate marriage. Suddenly, families completely rejected that old economically driven patriarchal model. Instead, people actually expected marriage to provide romance, sexual fulfillment, and emotional growth.
But here's a really fascinating piece of the puzzle. The concept of tradition existed long before European colonists even arrived. North America was already home to over 240 groups of Native Americans with incredibly distinct family patterns. And while European systems were strictly patrilineal, passing property and rights down through the father, many Native American tribes actually organized their entire family structures matrilineally, meaning they traced rights and property entirely through the mother's line.
And history also reveals a complete 180-degree flip in how society viewed children. Get this, in the colonial era, kids were actually believed to be evil by nature. Childhood wasn't this precious special phase. Kids were essentially treated as many adults who were fostered or bound out as apprentices as early as age 7. No way, right? But by the 19th century, this entirely new sentimentality took over. Children were suddenly viewed as innocent beings who needed protection, and adolescence was literally invented as a phase where youth were kept economically dependent.
So the real game changer here is that industrialization physically separated work from home. When families transitioned from self-sufficient farms to urban wage-earning environments in the 19th century, it created a radically new division of labor. Men's paid wages became identified as real work, which effectively invented the role of the male breadwinner, while women's unpaid domestic labor was suddenly unrecognized, cementing the totally distinct role of the housewife.
All right, moving on to Section 2, the social class divide.
Taking a step out of history, the American class system reveals a pretty hidden architecture today. While the middle class does make up a slight majority at 52%, a massive portion of the country exists in the working class at 30%, and the lower class at 17%. And then you have the upper class, which holds an extraordinary amount of wealth, making up just 1%. What's absolutely crucial to understand here is that your position in this breakdown completely changes how your family operates on a daily basis.
Sociologists actually use the term life chances to explain this, because social class isn't just some number sitting in a bank account. It literally dictates the facets of your everyday survival. Your socioeconomic status directly affects your health, your physical safety, how long you're going to live, and the overall well-being of everyone in your family.
To put that into perspective, consider this staggering figure. In 2018, an astounding 38 million Americans lived in poverty. And that is not just a dry economic statistic. That number represents severe, ongoing family stress, poor health outcomes, lower birth weights, and increased feelings of hopelessness and despair right inside those family units.
Even heavier is this fact. 1 out of every 6 children under the age of 18 is living below the poverty line. These childhood poverty spells drastically alter their life chances, literally from day one, which so often translates into lower earning potential and continued struggles throughout their entire adult lives.
Because of these stark economic realities, we see massive contrasts in parenting styles across the divide. Middle-class parents are often locked into what sociologists call cultivation. That frantic schedule of extracurricular activities designed to build self-esteem and prep kids for college. Working-class parenting, on the other hand, lacks those same financial resources and instead focuses on natural development, which emphasizes compliance, free play, and spending a lot more time with relatives. For lower-class families navigating deep economic uncertainty, daily survival often relies heavily on something called fictive kin. This is the practice of extending a family-like status to neighbors and close friends. When resources are incredibly scarce, this deeply connected network of non-blood relatives becomes absolutely essential to meeting daily needs.
Which brings us to Section 3, Racial and Ethnic Diversity.
When we dismantle those ethnocentric distortions and look objectively at the data, it is incredibly clear there is no single American experience. For example, Asian Americans currently have the highest median incomes and lowest poverty rates, while Hispanic and African American families face significantly higher poverty rates, and each group exhibits completely unique, deeply rooted family dynamics and structures.
Historically, minority families got unfairly squeezed through this narrow middle-class white lens, sometimes even negatively labeled if they didn't exactly match that traditional nuclear model. But modern sociologists emphasize the profound strengths inherent in these groups. African American families, for instance, showcase incredible resilience. They feature a very long history of egalitarian dual-earner households, a huge tradition of family loyalty, and a high reliance on highly supportive, multi-generational extended households.
Now, as the largest ethnic group in the U.S., Hispanic families exhibit incredible diversity based on their specific country of origin, but they frequently share this beautiful foundational concept known as La Familia. This dynamic heavily emphasizes child-rearing and perfectly balances the nuclear family core with a very powerful, supportive extended family network.
Let's contrast this with something called symbolic ethnicity. Unlike marginalized groups, white Americans of European descent often experience their ethnicity simply as a choice. They can celebrate their European heritage on specific holidays, like dressing up for St. Patrick's Day or Oktoberfest, but then they can easily blend right back into the majority culture without facing racial discrimination in their everyday family life.
Now for Section 4, the multiracial future.
Looking ahead, multiracial families are completely reshaping the American landscape, and they're growing 3 times faster than the general population. Because these parents often don't share a single racial identity, they have to actively choose how they socialize their children for a pretty complex world. They might use promotive socialization to encourage a colorblind worldview, protective socialization to teach their kids to actively defend their ethnic identity, or passive socialization, which unfortunately leaves kids with far fewer resources to handle discrimination.
And straddling 2 different worlds presents a very unique challenge: microaggressions. These are subtle, everyday verbal or behavioral indignities that communicate negative slights. Multiracial individuals frequently encounter these, sometimes shockingly even from within their own extended families.
And our final section, a constant state of change. So, the single undeniable takeaway from all of this data is that the American family is absolutely not static. Knowing that the rigid idea of the traditional family is largely a myth, one shaped by brief historical windows and very specific social classes, I'll leave you with this. How are these massive economic, historical, and cultural shifts shaping your own family right now? Take a moment to reflect on where your uniquely structured family fits into this ever-changing matrix. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and always keep questioning what you think you know.